Welcome to our November Civic Awareness Series on behalf of the Robert R. McCormick House and Cantini Park and the League of Women Voters of Wheaton and Greater Kane County. Welcome to this month's Civic Awareness Series. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce acclaimed author Alex Kotlowitz, author of American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, as our presenter tonight. But before we go any further, I do want to do an announcement. You may have realized by now this presentation has a feature of closed captioning, and it's kind of a cool feature. The version that we have is really good, but yeah, it's about 85% correct. So you're going to probably expect some misspellings as you go through, but it's all there to sort of help those who can understand what's happening a little bit better. But and you can actually adjust the size of the font through that adjustment. You'll see it says CC in the bottom. Now, if you want to turn off the closed captioning, just go to the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and select hide subtitles. So that way you don't have to see the subtitles. If you want to bring them back, you just reverse the process and you're on your way again. It's kind of a really cool feature. It's a relatively new feature of our presentation, so I want to make sure that you take full advantage of it. Throughout these Civic Awareness Series programs, be they in person or virtual, I always try to tie our subject to something that Robert McCormick was passionate about. Robert McCormick was the editor and publisher of Chicago Tribune. He died in 1955, and here at Cantini was his suburban estate. And when he died in 1955, he had no children, so his personal fortune was transformed into the Mccormick Foundation, and that's what maintains Cantini. But today's subject, I want to tell you about the Mccormick Foundation. It's through the foundation, I think, that you're really going to see Robert's legacy in the subject that we're going to talk about tonight. And more specifically, Chicago's South Side. In the last couple of years, the foundation has really focused its efforts within Chicago, and more specifically on the South Side. So these topics that we're talking about today are all things that the foundation is involved in through its grant-making programs to try to improve those situations in the city. So that's the legacy part of this presentation, is through the foundation. Now, before I hand it over to Barb to do the introductions of Mr. Kotlowitz, I do want to tell you real quickly, I can't believe, like most of you, it's already October, which means November is going to be our last presentation, Civic Awareness Series in 2021. And on November 18th, we're going to bring author Rebecca Sive into the program, where she's going to talk about her recent book, Vote Her In. So it's a great program, again, virtual. So go to cantini.org and register for that. It's a free program. And we hope, as we move forward, you've been here to these presentations before. You know that the McCormick House itself is under a renovation project. And that project will continue probably until the early fall of next year. So chances are we're going to remain virtual until then. But I'm really excited about what's been happening at the house. We do these presentations in Colonel McCormick's library, Freedom Hall, and that room is going to remain just as we remember it. So I'm very excited. Granted, it's almost maybe a year from now, but I'm really excited about thinking about bringing everyone back in person to these programs. So I've talked long enough. So with that, I will hand it over to Barb.
Good evening. It's such a great honor and privilege to introduce you all to journalist and author Alex Kotlowitz. He is a former staff writer at the Wall Street Journal. His writings have appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and on This American Life. To acknowledge all the awards he has won would take up our whole lot of time together tonight. So I'll just move on to Mr. Kotlowitz has published 4 books: Never a City So Real, The Other Side of the River, A Story of Two Towns, and the award-winning There Are No Children Here, that has been selected as one of the 150 most important books of the 20th century. His latest book, American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, chronicles the lives of 14 people impacted by gun violence during the summer of 2013. The result is a portrayal of the human side of gun violence. American Summer takes us behind the headlines and introduces us to those affected by gun violence and will be the focus of our conversation tonight. Please feel free to ask questions as we hold this conversation in the Q&A, and we'll intersperse them amongst our conversation. So welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, Bob, thanks for having me.
So your book offers a really unique perspective. We always see national conversation after appalling mass shooting events such as Parkland, Columbine, and the music festival in Las Vegas. But yet we hear little about the victims and outcomes of how shootings in our neighborhoods affect those living in that community. Why do you think the reporting leaves out those who experience the daily effects of violence?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think you're right. In the wake of Parkland and Newtown, these incredibly tragic moments in our country's recent history, we asked all the right questions, not the least of which is how does a community and how do individuals move forward carrying the burden of this tragedy? And we don't ask that question of people who are shot or survive shootings in places like Chicago. In fact, I think there's a kind of a notion out there, a kind of myth that somehow young people get accustomed to the violence or get hardened to it. This has, I think, everything to do with the deep schisms in this country around race and class. The communities in Chicago that are most profoundly impacted by the violence are, one, neighborhoods that are deeply distressed, and two, they're neighborhoods of color, Black and Latino. Communities that are physically and spiritually isolated from the rest of the city. And so I think it's easy, sometimes far too easy, for the rest of us to turn our heads and say, that's not us. I always remember there was a moment many years ago after the Run and Children here came out, and I was having lunch with a former foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune who had just come back to the city, and he had spent some time on the West Side and told me that he felt like he was in a foreign country. And I remember cringing at that. I wish I had said something in the moment, but these are our neighbors, and yet they feel incredibly distant from the rest of the city.
Why was it important for you then to tell their stories?
Well, it's what I do. I'm a storyteller. I believe fiercely in the power of narrative, of storytelling. I mean, first of all, stories have this ability, this capacity to bring us places we otherwise wouldn't venture and to introduce us to people we otherwise wouldn't meet. And the other side of it, of course, the stories too make us feel less alone. We often see ourselves in the experiences of others. And God knows in this moment in time in this country, there's far too much shouting going on. And the beauty of stories is it lets people find their own way. And as you know, and as you alluded to in the introduction, the stories that I tell, the stories that I'm drawn to are stories of those who are along the margins, those who are trying to stand erect in this world slumping around them. And I think it's in their yarns, their stories, that we can come to understand the social compact we have in this country and where we've lived and haven't lived up to the ideals of this nation. And so it's really important for me that we hear the voices of people like those that I write about in An American Summer. These are people who otherwise I think we would never hear from.
We wouldn't know what was going on without reading. When I was reading the book, there appeared to me to be some reoccurring themes of forgiveness, survival, guilt, fear, transformation, and search for identity. Sadly, we can't get to all the stories, but there are several stories I'd like to focus on, if you don't mind. The first is Lisa.
Yeah.
Lost her son Darren to violence. And can you share her story of a mother struggling to protect her son from influences of the neighborhood, and yet she had this remarkable ability to survive the loss of her son and find grief and strength and forgiveness?
Yeah, Lisa Daniels is this remarkable woman, and I have the very good fortune not only to meet her, but also to be able to sit down and hear her story. Lisa grew up, lived on the south side of Chicago in Englewood, and she had two sons. Her oldest son went to the University of Illinois, where he majored in engineering, and her younger son, Darren, in high school began to stray. He was a kid who he got into fights. He would sometimes cut school. He began dabbling in drugs. And when Darren turned 18 and was involved in the drug trade, Lisa had to ask him to leave the house. And you flash forward 7 years later, Darren's 25 years old, and Lisa one evening gets a call from one of Darren's friends to learn that Darren has been shot and killed in a drug deal that's gone awry. And the first thing that happens is the local newspaper, the shooting happened in a south suburb, and the local newspaper runs a story that says former convict shot and killed. And it's not even until the third paragraph that they mention Darren by name. And Lisa really took issue with that. It wasn't that she felt there was anything factually wrong with the story, but she felt it was incomplete. It was an incomplete story of her son. And so she wrote this letter to the paper, partly in response to that, and also partly in response to the online response, which, referred to her son as a clown, as a thug, asking where are his parents. And she writes this letter kind of reclaiming his story, that Darren was this kid who loved football. He loved watching documentaries on the Discovery Channel. He was a really loyal son. He was also a father. And indeed, he had served time on a gun charge. I mean, she wasn't, again, denying the facts of the story, but it was incomplete. So the first thing she does is reclaim his story. And then she assumes that the person who shot her son is going to be convicted and sentenced to a long time in prison. It seems like a pretty straightforward case. And one afternoon, she gets a phone call from the prosecutor, from the state's attorney, who explains to Lisa that it actually may be a more difficult case than they anticipated, that the shooter is claiming self-defense and the only witness has a criminal past, and that they want to offer him a plea deal, but they don't want to move ahead without Lisa's cooperation. So Lisa asked to sleep on it overnight. And the next day she says, I'm agreeable to offering a plea deal. The only thing that I ask is that I get to speak at the sentencing. And so at the sentencing, Lisa gives what's called a victim's impact statement. Ordinarily, a victim impact statement is where a relative of the victim or a friend of the victim gets up and talks about the impact that that person's death has had on them and others. And Lisa does some of that. But what Lisa does in this moment in the courtroom, which is just remarkable, is she gives this incredibly eloquent, poignant, moving speech about how she stood up for her son. She was going to stand up for Michael Reed, the person who was allegedly had shot her son. And she ends up asking the judge for leniency. And he ends up sentencing Michael Reed to 15 years. And as Michael Reed leaves the courtroom, he turns around, he's shackled, and just mouths the words, "Thank you." And he and Lisa actually have a correspondence over the coming years when he's in prison. It's this remarkable moment of forgiveness. And Lisa would be the first person to say that not everybody is in a position to do this, but she felt like it could just as easily have been the other way around, that her son, and they end up shooting at each other, that her son lived and Michael Reed had died. And so she felt that she was going to stand up and represent Michael Reed. And it is this kind of remarkable moment. And Lisa's, the epilogue to all this, which is not in the book, but after the book comes out, Lisa Daniels is invited by the governor to serve on the state parole board. And so she now serves on the state parole board. This institution whose very task is to wrestle and grapple with this notion of forgiveness, because they have inmate after inmate coming to them asking to be released. And so Lisa has gotten people on that panel to think about forgiveness, and I think in a different way, in a different light.
It was a story that made me cry a little and weep for her, and now serves as a role model that we could
Yeah.
all reconsider some of our actions and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Do we know what Michael Reed is doing now?
We don't. He's out of prison. And last I spoke with Lisa, she wants to meet with him, but I think that is going to, take some strength. I mean, some resolve, but she's getting there.
Another story that really opened my mind and heart to the experiences of these journeys these young people go up to that are exposed to violence is Thomas.
Yeah.
Who lived on what you call in the book, the block of death.
Right. Yeah.
His childhood is just tragic.
Yeah, Thomas grew up on the south side of Chicago. I met Thomas originally working on a two-part series for This American Life on Harper High School on the south side of Chicago, a school that had experienced in the previous year, they had 21 current and former students shot and wounded, another 7 shot fatally. And I went and embedded with a couple of social workers, these incredible women there, Crystal Smith and Anita Stewart. And I just immediately fell in love with them. And this is where I wanted to hang out. And their office was this speaks volumes to where social workers fit in the hierarchy of our public schools. But they had a windowless cinder block room in the middle of the first floor. But it was where all these students came for comfort, for respite, for refuge. And it was there that I met Thomas. And Thomas, as you mentioned, was a young man. I met him when he was 16. He had, at that point, had already witnessed 2 people murdered, including a young girl who, when Thomas was 12 years old, Thomas was at her birthday party and she was shot and killed by a stray bullet. And when I met Thomas, he had just witnessed and experienced his 3rd murder. His best friend, a young girl, Shikaki Ashby, they were sitting on a porch talking with each other, and somebody ran out of a gangway and started shooting and shot and killed Shikaki. And Thomas was still reeling from this. And so the story is a story of grief, of trying to reckon with this loss. And it's also about his relationship with Anita Stewart, this incredible social worker who is with them every step of the way. And Thomas, I think, like so many young men, doesn't have the language to talk about what he's experiencing, but what he is experiencing with so many others is this, not unlike the post-traumatic stress disorder we see in veterans returning from combat, except for people like Thomas, there's no post about the PTSD because they lose somebody and then they have to look over their shoulder as to what's going to happen next. The other remarkable part about Thomas's story is he ends up testifying in the case, and then because he feels incredibly vulnerable, ends up moving to St. Louis for a year to get out of the city. It's a real act of courage on his part. And one of the things that makes me angry is too often I hear about all these people who won't testify after witnessing a shooting, and they talk about the no snitch code of the street. But the truth of the matter is most people are unwilling to come forward because they feel unsafe. And that speaks volumes about the relationship of these communities with the police.
And what we usually see too is after incidents like Thomas experienced was the news coverage. They're right out there with the van and they're talking to the survivors. And Liz asks the question, the local news channels do cover shootings almost more than we would like, and they do interview family members of the victims. Is there a better way for them to cover these stories?
Yeah, I think two things. I think one is to recognize, too often we're there in the moment afterwards. We're catching people in this moment of grief. And I think one of the things you'll often see, especially on the TV news, is you'll see a parent who the first response when they're asked by a reporter about their child is to say, my child wasn't a part of a gang. And there's this kind of defensiveness because I think there's an assumption out there by so many that those who were shot in the city are people who are somehow involved in drugs, involved in the gangs, and they're undercurrent is they're kind of getting their just desserts. And I think what we don't reckon with is this trauma that doesn't go away. I mean, imagine losing a child or a best friend or a parent to an act of violence. And then, of course, having to worry about the aftermath, worrying about whether it's going to happen yet again. And for some of these young people, many like Thomas have lost more than one friend or family member. So there's that. I think the other thing, and as I know we'll talk a little bit about this at some point, but to sort of talk about systemically what's going on, why, look, it's no accident that most of these shootings and killings are happening in deeply distressed neighborhoods. And so we've got to have a conversation about the Great Divide in our city and the Great Divide in our country.
When you bring up Anita, it really brings up some of the mentions throughout the book of the impact of the people working in these neighborhoods. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Anita, when she had to tell Thomas that she was going to another school, and she was afraid for his future, that she sat in her car and cried because she was leaving these children that she cared so deeply about and had such great hopes for them.
Yeah. No, I think one of the groups of people in our public schools that I think are so undervalued and so under-resourced are our social workers and counselors. And it seems to me that should be an absolute priority of a school system like CPS. I mean, these kids come into the school building every morning, and it's not like they suddenly leave all their burdens aside. They bring them with them into the school, into the classroom. And can you imagine trying to focus, trying to concentrate after having lost someone so close to you and not getting any counseling, not getting any attention? And again, this goes back to our earlier conversation about Newtown and Parkside. Those are places where all those students got intensive counseling, as they should. And those communities, came together and counseled each other, comforted each other. That's not the case in these communities.
And I know we didn't talk about this beforehand, but it brings the question to mind when we talk about gangs and things like that. There was a reason why Thomas and other children in those neighborhoods join associations or clubs on their block. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So let me say the landscape has changed dramatically over the last 30 years in Chicago. When I began writing on these issues, when I was working on my first book, There Are No Children Here, in the late 1980s, the gangs in the city, one, were very hierarchical. You had a real delineation of who was in charge. And two, the gangs were really organized around the drug trade. Their disputes with other gangs usually had to do with drug turf, with controlling certain corners or parts of the city. And in the late 1990s, the feds went after the gangs and basically cut the heads off of the snake. They went and and imprisoned many of the leaders. And so the gangs completely fell apart. And the consequence of that was we now have, the police estimate, some 600 different organizations, cliques, crews, whatever you want to call them, organized block by block, organized by geography, not organized around drug turf. And what you find is that if you live on a particular block, it's virtually impossible not to be associated with the group or clique or crew that's on your street. And the disputes that we see so often in the press are not usually around drugs, but usually often that emerge out of some personal dispute and erupt into something more.
I think you mentioned one time that people reacted due to perceived injustices because, you know, that's the only reaction they have to what they see around them is not being fair.
Right. And, so you grow up in a community like Englewood on the south side of Chicago. And I'll never forget, a number of years ago, there was a gentleman who was with the World Bank who had come to visit Chicago. He had done a lot of writing on the violence in the developing world. And one of the things that he had found is that the countries that had the most violence were the countries that were not desperately poor, but the countries in which you had an incredible division in which you had the desperately poor living not too far from the very wealthy. So countries in which you had accumulation of wealth aside these very distressed neighborhoods. And his theory is that people grew up in these incredibly distressed neighborhoods and grew up resentful. They grew up completely aware of what was not theirs, of what opportunities were not available to them. And that there's this anger that gets misdirected, And so he comes to Chicago, I'll never forget this, and he goes and spends some time in Englewood, and he says, this is it, this is the same thing. He says, you walk out of your house in Englewood and you look at this beautiful gleaming skyline and you know what is not yours. How can you not help but feel bitter and angry and resentful? And I think more often than not, that anger is, again, kind of misdirected. And it's, as you alluded to, it's very hard in that milieu to find any kind of respect. And so it's what they're after. And so you disrespect someone, and it has a kind of power that it might not have for someone like you or me.
Right. You talk about a man in the book who shot and killed a man,
Right.
Was sent to prison, was released, a totally different person who really brought together this tie of PTSD, war
Right.
criminals, and the youth in Englewood and on the South Side or in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Can you tell us about Eddie?
Sure. This is Eddie Bocanegra, who is a dear, dear friend, someone I have so much admiration for. And when I think of Eddie's story, you talk about forgiveness and Lisa forgiving someone else. Eddie's story is really a story about trying to forgive yourself. And so Eddie grew up in a little village. He was a part of a local gang there. And at 18, he shot and killed a rival gang member. And he, as you say, goes to prison for 13 years. And I think, like for many who, partly it's the maturity of age, partly it's having some time to contemplate and reflect on your own life. But Eddie emerges, I wouldn't say a different person, but I think Eddie emerges the person who he probably really is, this deeply caring, empathic, thoughtful individual. And so he comes out, I met Eddie when he was working for what was then Ceasefire, now Cure Violence, as a violence interrupter. Eddie now runs what I think is one of the most innovative violence prevention programs in the country, called Ready Chicago out of Heartland Alliance. First of all, Eddie, I should say, went back after college, went and got his BA, got his Master's of Social Work from the University of Chicago. He's now married to a fellow social worker, teaches at U of I, and they have 7 children, large family. His wife is, they have a large family. But Eddie, Eddie is deeply aware of the kind of trauma that people experience in these communities as a result of the violence. I mean, one, personally, he's experienced that trauma. I mean, not only did he take someone else's life, but he too lost friends to the violence of the streets. And he also had 2 brothers who served in Iraq. one of whom suffered from PTSD. And I remember the story is that when this brother visited Eddie in prison and was going through a really rough time trying to reckon with his experience in combat, he goes and visits Eddie. And at one point he says to Eddie, he says, Eddie, you have what I have. You have PTSD. And Eddie begins to think about trauma. So he runs this program, which what I love about the program he runs is they've done this research and have found the young men who are most likely to be shot or shoot someone. And they take them and help them get work, get jobs, which is really important. Nothing new there, but it's absolutely essential, right, to one's identity, just to your day-to-day life. But the other part of it is that these young men are also required to partake in cognitive behavioral therapy. These kind of therapy groups where they talk about their experiences and their trauma, where they're given the language to acknowledge and recognize what they're experiencing. You know, you were talking about young men who have flashbacks, who, you know, turn to self-medicate with drugs or alcohol, who have trouble sleeping, who are really restless, have trouble concentrating. I mean, Eddie himself will tell you that he doesn't want to stop moving, because when he stops moving, it all kind of floods back. But Eddie's just this remarkable individual who's become a real leader, not only in Chicago, but nationally, on questions about how we make some dent in the street violence.
I was also struck by the support that he received from his wife,
Yeah.
who seems to be a phenomenal woman who stood by him through his ups and downs.
Yeah, no, Catherine's absolutely remarkable. She got her PhD and now teaches at UIC at Jane Addams. But yeah, Catherine kind of serves. I mean, I was laughing about it with Eddie the other week, because I was talking about how important it is to, have a counselor, and Eddie said, well, I got Catherine, I have my wife, and she's helped Eddie kind of see things that he doesn't see, and to recognize, and at one point, she tells him that, he's kind of always complimented on how resilient he is. And as she says to him, resilience comes with a price, that it's just not a clean journey.
And I think it just emphasizes, as Anita was to Thomas and Catherine is to Eddie, the need for support for them do you feel that that's an element that maybe needs to be investigated?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that, I think one of the things that for me was really apparent in the people I met, so many of them felt a sense of loneliness, a sense of isolation. I remember one young man who lost his brother at one point said to me, nobody can understand what I'm going through, and so, and you hear this over and over again. And people kind of live, and we all know this, we've all grieved loved ones who have passed. And if you're by yourself, you just kind of perseverate on that grief, and it begins to eat away at you. And so it's really helpful to have people to talk to and let them know that you're not the only one who has experienced this, that it's not, that there's not some flaw in you that has, made it difficult for you to focus, or has made you experience flashbacks, or has made you have trouble sleeping, that this is part and parcel of this kind of profound grief.
There's a story of Victor and Mike, and
Yeah.
I think that they probably epitomize the story of loneliness and not feeling that you're yourself. Can you tell us their story?
Yeah, I don't know if I can do justice to Mike and Victor's story. So it is a story that it's a really moving, very moving story. I'm going to tell the short version of it, because there's so much to it. It's such a rich, complicated story. But Mike, when he's in his 20s, hard drinker, Irish Catholic, he's basically told by his boss, he works in real estate, he's working around the clock. His boss tells him, you got to take a day off or afternoon off and volunteer somewhere, do something outside of work because it's really getting to you. And so he ends up volunteering at a place in the western suburbs that is taking in orphans, people who, children who have lost for one reason or another, been removed from their parents and don't have foster care. And he becomes very attached to one of the young boys there, a Black boy, Victor, and they become very close. And the long and short of it is Mike ends up not only taking Victor in with him, but ends up adopting Victor. And Mike, is concerned about staying in the city, raising a Black boy in the city. And so he moves out to the suburbs thinking this is where it'll be safe. And Victor's one of the few Blacks in his school. And one of the things that happens is that the students there begin to assume, because he is Black, that he has access to drugs and the gangs. And Victor begins to take on this role, that I think what he thinks is expected of him. He's an outsider. And he and Mike, again, it's such a complicated story, but he and Mike have this falling out and they move apart from each other as Victor is in his late teens, early 20s. And Mike is wrestling with his own secrets, which I won't tell because I don't want to give away the story. And he too is an outsider who doesn't really belong. And it's ultimately what brings him and Victor back together. And they're incredibly close now. Victor is now, I believe, in his late 30s. And they're doing great. But I just heard from Mike a couple of weeks ago. So it's a story that has a happy ending, but it is a story about sort of finding your place and sort of try and being an outsider because of race or class or other matters.
It struck me living here in the suburbs, the stereotypes that are pervasive, that poor Victor wanted to have friends and he felt that he had to people approached him with a stereotype and he fell into the stereotype. And it seems that we have to find a way. Is there a way to overcome those stereotypes so that
Well, again, and I don't want to sound naive about this, but again, that's why we tell stories, if we tell stories well and honest. And it's one of the things that I'm up against constantly in my work is trying to write about people who I think readers think they already know, and to sort of get beyond the tropes and stereotypes that people have and let people get to know people like Eddie or Lisa or Victor and kind of come to know them for these rich, complicated people that they are. But there's no question, Chimamanda Adichie, the novelist, has this great TED talk about the danger of the single story, the danger of thinking we know when in fact we know very little. That because somebody's growing up on the west side of Chicago, that we think we know their story and the shape of their narrative. And so when I'm working on my books and my magazine pieces and radio pieces, one of the challenges for me is to really capture the complexity and the dynamicism of people, and to go beyond, I think, our expectations and assumptions.
Well, Carl is asking, how does this resilience come at a price? What is that price?
So I think, for Eddie, for example, he's people look up to him, especially people in the community which he came from. And so they look to him for guidance. They look to him for support. And it's, I wouldn't say it's a burden because Eddie really, takes it all so seriously. But it takes its toll. People lean on you because you appear to be so resilient. And the other part about being resilient is kind of reckoning with your past. And that's not easy. I mean, I think for many, the easy path forward is not to reckon with your past, to just compartmentalize it and let it be and move on, and not try to make sense of it. And for somebody like Eddie, that resilience is so partly founded in his determination to make sense of his past, of who he was.
How do the people in the neighborhood, I read about the fear that they have of coming forward, of being a witness, the dangers that they face in doing what they know is the right thing, but they have this overwhelming threat to their existence by doing that. How that resilience in itself to live within their own prison. You talk of, oh, I forget the name, I'm sorry, where he almost lives in a prison of his house and with earphones, and because he can't be himself.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's really hard. And I think it's one of the things we don't acknowledge is that constant sense of fear. And I'm sure, we've all been afraid at some point in our lives, and to live, and fear can really, I mean, I've experienced it, that anxiety, it can be debilitating, it can be paralyzing, and to live with that on a day-to-day basis, I just can't imagine what it does to the human spirit, to the human soul. And the thing about, people in combat who live with that fear every day, they at least have that light at the end of the tunnel, this notion, this knowledge that at some point they're going to go home. Yeah. And that's not the case for people like Thomas.
And another thing that I think would be difficult is for them to, for people, not them, for people to overcome the distrust of the police that lives in those neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, it's complicated though, because there is distrust of others, and yet it is what they know. And what I want to be careful about is there is community. I always think back, when in 1999 when we announced the transformation plan of public housing, we announced we were going to tear down all the public housing high rises, and they should have been torn down a long time ago. And I think there was a lot to celebrate, that finally we were tearing down these buildings that were built on the cheap. They were a bulwark to segregation. They were completely neglected over the years. But I think what we didn't realize, but we heard from residents who were really angry and upset about the raising of public housing, is this is what they knew. This was their community. And so I think that's what we have to be careful of, is that there is a sense, people, we all relish that sense of community. And you go into places like Englewood or West Garfield Park, and you see signs of that. You see these community gardens, you see people working on abandoned properties. And I think, again, one of the myths that, for example, around the violence is people are saying, for example, I remember hearing this in the wake of George Floyd's murder, is why all these people are protesting police violence, but why aren't they out there, protesting the violence that happens amongst each other in the community? But people are out there. And that's the thing about it. People are out there, they're marching, they're rallying, they're coming together to have picnics, to honor the deceased. You see it over and over and over again in these communities.
Driving into the city, you can see the signs that are posted: no gangs, no signs.
Right. The block club signs, right? This kind of great, this announcement that we are a community. We are going to try as best we can to stick by each other.
You really don't talk in the book about policy or solutions, but it's more than apparent that there has to be some systemic change. So what are your thoughts about what could be substantive change? What can we as listeners do? What should we be thinking about?
Right. So yeah, so I was very clear about this in the book that I was not going to write about policy. And probably because I don't think we fully know. But I also feel like one of the reasons we tell stories is not to answer questions, but to ask questions. And that's what I wanted to do in this book. So I think, so there are some things that are encouraging. One of which is in recent years, we've begun to look at violence as an issue of public health. We have traditionally viewed it completely as a law enforcement issue. And I think finally we're beginning to move beyond that. Though I will say, I've been a little discouraged in recent months that there's been so much attention from local politicians around law enforcement, because this is not a law enforcement issue. It's not that law enforcement isn't a part of the issue, but it's not a law enforcement issue. I think there are a number of things. I think one, we've got to deal directly with the trauma, not unlike what Eddie is doing with Ready Chicago. We've got to also, and this seems so self-evident that I'm almost hesitant to say it, but again, the commonality in all these communities, whether it's Chicago, St. Louis, South Bend, is that the violence is happening in deeply distressed neighborhoods. Neighborhoods where that window of opportunity is not only not widened, but it's actually narrowed. And so we've got to find a way to rebuild these communities, to think about how we can integrate people back into our cities. And I mean that in the most literal way, is that we've lost the conversation about racial integration. 1 out of every 6 homes on the west and south side of Chicago are abandoned or vacant, still lingering consequence of the 2008 housing crisis. So we've got to find a way to rebuild community, which in turn will also fortify family. And then there's the police. There's been a lot of conversation about what the police should be doing. What's really evident to me, if I were superintendent of the police, which I'm not, but I think the number one priority would be to figure out, and I'm not clear how to do this, but to figure out how we rebuild trust with these communities, which we are now so distant from. Just the other day, I was with a friend who's a federal judge and also the head of the federal defenders. And one of the things that they were saying is that it's getting harder and harder to find jurors who don't feel strong distrust towards the police. White, black, you name it, which to me is an indication that that should be the absolute number one priority of a police department, is to figure out how we reestablish that trust.
Do you think the reforming of the Cabrini Green property has been successful? Is it a model of the future?
Yeah. So, they tore down, as I mentioned, the idea of this transformation plan, they were going to tear down all the high rises and in their place build these mixed income communities. So they did the easy part very quickly. They tore down all the high rises. And we also, again, because of the incompetence of the city and the housing authority, we very quickly lost track of where all the residents went, but became clear that they were going to equally distressed communities that were equally segregated. We have not built that replacement housing that was promised. In fact, if you go on the south side, there's still acres of vacant land on the south side. So I don't know that it's a model for much of anything at the moment. Cabrini is maybe the one small exception to that, in that Cabrini sat in this really wealthy part of the city, unlike the other public housing projects. It was that very valuable real estate. And so those developers who wanted that real estate, they had to make a bargain that if they were going to go in and build, market rate homes, they also had to provide homes for former Cabrini residents. And so there's been some of that. But I think the transformation plan has been, for me, a real lesson that we ought to really examine. It is a failure. It was a failure. It did, as promised, it tore down public housing high rises, but it did little to change the trajectory of all those people that it displaced.
Paul asked the question about the news and what role they could play. You know, he says for weeks we hear about Gabby Petito, but we never see the press follow any of the 5 to 15 murders on the South Side. Why doesn't the press talk about these things?
I think we're doing a better job than we were. And there are some remarkable reporters out there doing stuff. But we still have not, I mean, this has a lot to do, I think, with the lack of diversity in our newsrooms. I also will say, too, to be fair, at the moment, the Tribune is a skeleton of what it once was. It will probably only continue to kind of shed weight because, it was recently brought out by a predatory hedge fund that it really has absolutely no interest in journalism. And so we've got to, I mean, one of my concerns in general is the complete decimation of local journalism. And you see that here in Chicago. So I think at the moment, one of my concerns is we just simply don't have the reporter power to cover the kinds of stories that we need to be covering.
My friends in Florida love to post on social media about that Chicago is the murder capital of the world. And when I look at the statistics, we're not even in the top 10.
Yeah, right.
Did you worry that Chicago in the title of the book would perpetuate that myth at all?
I thought about it. I'm very upfront in the very beginning of the book to mention just that Chicago has become the poster child for violence in this country, and yet we're not even in the top 10 most violent and per capita murders. And that's most usually been the case. It's not just now. We're going through an unusually difficult moment, I will say, in the city. But if maybe one of the things that will spur our political and civic leadership to move forward is the image of the city. If that's what it takes, I say I'm all for it. I think it's been, again, just far too easy that the violence has been so isolated in these communities. It's been so easy to turn our heads to them. The violence has begun to spill over, and there are people, Ken Griffin, a hedge fund owner here in Chicago, gave a speech at the economics club last week and, compared Chicago somewhat glibly to Afghanistan and began talking about the possibility that he might move his 1,000-person office outside of Chicago because the violence was spilling over. And what I want to say to him is, where have you been? Why now? I mean, was it somehow less important to you that your neighbors, because they were Black or Latino, they were being killed? That it was somehow less important to you to grapple with it, and it's only important now because it has an impact on you and your white neighbors. I was very angry at his talk, and also was really really distressed at the kind of glib comparison of the city to Afghanistan. What I wanted to say to him, and I probably should be careful here, but does that make you one of the warlords? But I will restrain myself.
I know our time is coming to the end, but I do want to ask you, the book had such an impact on me. It's not a book that you sit down and read from start to finish. You have to stop and you have to digest and you have to think, what kind of impact did it have on you hearing those stories?
Well, thanks, Barb. That means a lot. It was a really difficult book. I mean, I realized, I was talking with people about the absolute worst day in their life, and it was really hard for people. There's one young man in the book I talked to who lost his son, and I can remember this. I had kind of fallen out of touch with him. I hadn't spoken to him in 6 months, and I got a text from him asking how I was, and I said, I'm glad you contacted me. I needed to sit down and ask some more questions. He said, absolutely, come on by. And I went by and was there for about 45 minutes, and he clearly wanted to talk about stuff. And then at the end of the 45 minutes, I remember he looked at his watch and said, I think it's time now. And and he had had enough. And it was this kind of, this mixed emotion of on one hand, on his part, wanting to share his story, having somebody to talk to about it, on the other part, just being too hard. And it was hard for me. And I do remember when I sat down to write, I got really depressed in a way that I've never experienced before. I sought out a counselor and came to realize I was experiencing this kind of vicarious or secondary trauma, not unlike, I'm sure, what people like Anita and Crystal experience. And that small moment helped me even better viscerally understand what people like Thomas were going through. But I gotta say, in the end, this book, I know I won't say it's uplifting, but I came away with such admiration for the people I write about in this book. And they're all people, virtually all of them, who are kind of standing erect in this world that's slumping around them, moving forward. Some of them, like Eddie and Lisa, moving forward with such force and power. And I marvel at the people I met. And one of the perks about my work is that so many of the people I write about become a part of my life. And I feel like my life and my family's life is so much richer for
I agree with you. I mean, I felt such admiration for Eddie and for those who came through that made my petty grievances and worries.
Yeah.
It made me reevaluate what I'm worried about.
It does put things in perspective. Yeah.
It truly does. But to end on a more positive note, what's in the future for you?
So I'm beginning another book. It has nothing to do with Chicago. I'm a little reluctant to talk about it other than to say it's a story about three individuals whose lives all intersect with each other. And it's a story about what it means to belong to a country. It kind of asks this kind of larger question. One of them is an immigrant, but I don't want to say a whole lot more. But so I'm just beginning work on that.
Oh, well, book us in. We want to have you back for sure.
Great. Bob, thanks. This has been such a delight. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you. Know how you touched my life 20 years ago with There Are No Children Here, and once again with this new book, American Summer. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thanks, Barb.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Judy. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Judy, I'm afraid you're muted. There you go.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks. I always panic. Well, a huge thank you to Alex Kotlowitz. We truly appreciate your being here and talking about An American Summer. The stories, while tragic, were remarkable, and it was fascinating to hear your insight. And I'm eager to read the book now. Well, I was, but no time. So, and thank you to all of you in the audience and to Cantini, especially Stephanie and Will. Please join a follow-up discussion. And I unfortunately cannot seem to share my screen. And let's see is it sharing now? I don't know that it is.
It started.
Oh, here it is. Okay, thanks. So a follow-up discussion next Thursday, actually, Thursday, October 21 at 7 p.m. Steve McHugh from Moms Demand Action will lead a discussion about An American Summer and about safe guns in schools. And Rick Lathrop will speak about the Fox River Valley initiative, Do Not Stand Idly By. There will be a link for the program on the State League's website, lwvil.org. And then please join us, as Will had mentioned earlier, for our November Civic Awareness program. Author Rebecca Sive will discuss one of her books, Vote Her In. It will be Thursday, November 11th at 7 p.m. And you can register at cantini.org. And it will be brought to you by our partners, Cantini, and also the League of Women Voters of Glen Ellen. So we hope you'll join us then. And thank you so much for attending tonight's program. We really appreciate it. Good night.